We're going to, as you can see, I wanted to, I've done for the last couple of years, like a spring mini semester like I'm doing now, whole bunch, boom, 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 boom. So I'm trying to do 5 in a week or closest to that as I can do. I came up with World War I for a number of reasons. Perhaps you notice in the media and the press that the world's been taking greater notice of the First World War since 100 years. Now it's 1919, not 2019. The last 4 or 5 years there's been an unusual number of memoirs, TV shows and movies and all that kind of media events. And also because the past is always changing. And we all know Joe and I said, you won't know the French Revolution until you give it another 500 years. So, and he wasn't wrong about that. So we certainly see today, anybody with a little bit of sense, in sharp relief, the influence of the First World War in the world that you and I live in today. Because the First World War, for example, if you're Jewish, led to the Second World War, which was the Holocaust. And the First World War also led to the State of Israel, which is the Balfour Declaration. So the two great events are dated in the First World War. It's also true that things have kind of unraveled. One gets that feeling with the First World War. Europe certainly lost it all and has almost a weird aspect to it, but I'll discuss that as we go forward. Let me simply say that I want to thank all our sponsors. I have 4 out of 5 covered, 4.5 out of 5, so I'm still looking for a sponsor for half of the last one. Then I'll be completely done. Tonight, as you can see, is done by Jordan and Jeffrey. I'll leave their names out, that's what they prefer. Now the great-grandparents who endured the hardships of the First World War. I bet you there's probably everybody here, I would imagine, I would guess, that had, if not great-grandparents or that sort of thing, then uncles. Because you may possibly be descended from people who were lucky enough to leave Europe prior to 1914. I see some faces here, I know they went to America or to South Africa or someplace like that. That's true. But the brother didn't, and the sister didn't, and the parents didn't, and the uncle didn't. And it's a large topic. I can't do, obviously, the First World War in 5 talks. You cannot do the First World War and the Jews in 5 talks. I touched on this years ago. It's a very wide topic. And so I said I'm going to narrow it as closely as I can. First World War and the Orthodox Jews. But to tell you the truth, even that is not exactly true, because there were a ton and a half of Orthodox Jews I'm not going to have anything to say about. For example, the Sephardim. There was big wars in the Balkans, in the Middle East, my goodness. Many people don't know famous rabbis in Iraq were drafted in the Turkish army and left memoirs about it, and things like this. You say, what did the Iraq have to do with anything? There was a major war between the British and the Turks in Iraq for 4 years, and all over the place. So I'm going to be, when I say to Orthodox Jews, I'm going to be speaking very ethnocentrically over here, I'm sorry. And that is the Jews of Eastern Europe, primarily. And even that, I can only sketch for you. You know how that goes, and that's all you can do. So I'm going to try to sketch out the main lines of what happens to Jews in Eastern Europe during the years 1914, 1918, and a little bit beyond. Because as I shall endeavor to argue, the First World War in Eastern Europe actually goes another 4 years. Many people aren't aware of it, although what I just said is becoming more and more in the conscience of writers and historians now. They're all talking that kind of talk. I did it long ago. There are books coming out on this all the time. And if you're Jewish living in Eastern Europe, maybe that was the wrong place to live. So I will be confining my remarks to the Jews of 2 places, the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this would give you about 9-10 million of the Jewish people, which is Romanian and Robinian of Klal Yisrael. In the quantitative sense, certainly, possibly, arguably in the qualitative sense, and that's a matter of opinion. So what happened over there is kind of important, and as I say, probably affects a lot of us over here. Tangentially, the German Jews. I will not be able to have time to talk about the French, the British, the Italian Jews, and there were. So with those few apologetic remarks, and since the hour is, we're starting late, I'm going to plunge right into it. And therefore, we're looking over here at Spring Lectures of 2019, the first lecture. The name of the series is A Catastrophe, but not a Holocaust. the ordeal of Orthodox Jews in the First World War, 1914-1918. It's a catastrophe, but it's not a Holocaust. With our perspective, what we know happened in the Second World War, you might learn some surprising things. Tonight is the first lecture, which is called Negotiating the Perilous Waves of Modernity, Orthodox Jews in the Fin de siècle, which is a title I've used a lot lately, and that means the 20 or 25 years. The fin de siècle in French means the end of an era. So historians use that for the last 20 or 25 years prior to 1914. In England, they like to call it the Edwardian era, that sort of thing. But every country has that haze of memory simply because that was good old days where everything got mucked up, okay? And there's a lot of truth to that. But that's an ethnocentric, judgment, especially a European white judgment. But with that, here we go. The century of 1814 to 1914 were probably the worst years for Orthodox Judaism from the ideological and intellectual point of view ever, which is quite an interesting statement I just made. And that's because, as I see it, all four pillars of traditionalism were subject to trauma and crisis and even destruction in the 1800s, shall we say. I'm referring to what I always do in my talks, the four pillars of traditional Judaism before it became Orthodox: fundamentalism and nomianism, and autonomous coercive communities and cultural insularity. Fundamentalism means just what it means. The belief in Jewish fundamentalism. You do believe in you believe the reality of God, you believe he wrote the Torah, the Talmud, all that. They really believe this stuff, okay? Which is the way Jews were for a long time, until they weren't, okay? So basically the 19th century, especially from the European point of view, and that's what we're talking about over here, is one giant attack on fundamentalism, okay? I mean, let's go to the next one. Darwin, Marx, Freud, Wellhausen, he's the one who did Bible criticism. He can prove to you that the Bible was written at different times, different places by different people. Okay? Fraser, Golden Bough. Remember those names from yesteryear? He can show you where every story in the Bible and everywhere else is already written in some Chinese fable or some Indian thing. I'm real. You want a baby in the bulrush? We got that over here. You want a creation story about a flood? We got that over here. You want Abraham with the child at 100? We got that over here. You see? So basically, if you're a European intellectual, or what you and I call a Western intellectual, the 19th century is full of people who are considered the most dynamic intellectual forces in Western culture. I'm not talking about science. And by the way, I didn't mention any scientists over here. Darwin, maybe. But, religion can always do a ballet around science. You say God had set it up that way. But these other things not, okay? And therefore, anyone with a Western education usually lost their fundamentalism in the 19th century, maybe even later. This did not exist in Europe prior to the 19th century, okay? Nomianism, the practice of Judaism. As we know, Judaism is not really religion so much a belief, although there are some core beliefs without question. We just argue what they are, but they are core beliefs. Everybody believes in God, there are arguments what that means. Everybody believes the Torah was given, but there are arguments of what that means, right? Everybody says it was a Maimon Har Sinai, but there are a lot of arguments what that means, and so on and so forth. Having said that, these vague core ideas have always been, especially for the masses, covered up by ritual and practice. Who's a religious Jew? You keep Shabbos, we talk that kind of talk. You keep kosher, you keep Shabbos, you go to shul, you do this, you buy matzah or not. You understand? You make kiddush on Friday night or not. You light candles or not. I didn't mention any philosophy or theology here. I talked about practice. That's always Judaism has always been a very nomianistic religion, as opposed, for example, to Christianity, which from day one has been very doctrinal and trying to get precision on the theology. And Christianity, history of Christianity is full of what they call heresies, in which you didn't get it just right. Judaism didn't develop that way for a whole bunch of reasons, primarily among them. We never had a church in the Vatican. Right? Way back when we lost the Sanhedrin, ever since then, there's no authority, to impose anything upon Jews. So I always like to say, Will Rogers' famous word, he said, "I'm not the member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat," right? So an Orthodox Jew can say, "I'm not the member of any denomination or organized religious group. I'm an Orthodox Jew." The Reform have an organization, the Conservative got an organization, all the Christians group got organizations, even the Reconstructionists have a group. The Orthodox don't have a group, they got groups, 100 groups. So meaning that's it's a nominalistic kind of a business, okay? This was heavily under pressure with the new economy and the new education and many other things that went along in the 19th century. It just got harder to keep things, okay? The autonomous coercive communities, which once upon a time were the cement of Judaism. Wherever you lived, Jews lived in what they call Kehillah. According to the national state, the Goyim wanted it, and the Jews wanted it, each one for their own reason. And that meant if you were Jewish, you had to obey the rules of your community or suffer consequences, once upon a time. That's right, this was Judaism, no freedom of religion, the opposite. I'll just give a dumb example. You want to open a store on Shabbat, they close you down. You do it anyway, they'll fine you, they'll beat you up, they can do anything they want. That's the old days, okay, way back when. And we're so removed from that if I say it, people are horrified. This is once upon a time was normal. You get it? But that all was predicated upon the fact that the Jews are not members of any society. They're just living here. They're aliens. So you live in France, but you're not French. You live in Germany, you're not German. You live in Italy, you're not Italian. The Italians are the Italians. The Jews are just living here for one reason or another, like the gypsies. And this was recognized in state law ever since the Middle Ages and early Middle Ages in the form of autonomous Jewish communities. But that comes to an end with the French Revolution and the aftermath when the old state are replaced with the modern secular state that you and I are familiar with today. And the modern secular state, by definition, is secular and defines the state on secular lines. And therefore, religion becomes a private matter. And therefore, all powers of coercion are reserved to the state. Don't tell me you believe in a society without coercion, because then you have a lawless society. You want coercion, but I want coercion from the right people should exercise it. You understand? Sometimes in Baldwin we were familiar with a society without coercion. You understand? It's necessary, but the question is who administers the coercion. So, to make a long story short, once the French redefined themselves as a secular state, and we talked about this last year with the French Revolution in the summer, then the French state has nothing to say about Judaism. It's a private matter. Or even atheism, or Catholic, or Muslim, or anything else is a private matter. Therefore, there's no such thing as a Jewish community that can impose anything upon its people. To use code words that you will understand instantly without me explaining this, Sharia law. Right? There are people, the Muslim here said, we want to have Sharia law, so we want to control the Muslim. You say, oh no, America's a secular country, you can't have that. Somebody wants to, they can do it voluntarily, but not they can be forced. This is the 19th century. Little by little, in every country, the Jews got civil rights. In exchange for civil rights, you gave up your autonomous status, right? And this was so widespread, and even in countries where the Jews did not get civil rights, like Russia, the Jews did not get civil rights as long as the Tsar was there until he was overthrown in 1917. They did not get civil rights. They still removed the autonomous coercive communities as an anti-Semitic measure in order to weaken Judaism. Let me be clear about this. Until 1917, there were laws in the books in Russia that went like this. If you're a Christian, you can move here. If you're Jewish, you can't. If you're a Christian, you can become a pharmacist here. If you're Jewish, you can't. If you're a Christian, you can practice law. If you're Jewish, you can't. That's how the law was defined. And you could change your status by converting. But the law was formally discriminatory along religious lines. So don't transpose what you got today back then. So 3 of the 4 chairs, legs of the chair just fell apart. The autonomous coercive communities, the fundamentalism, and the nomism. What's left? Cultural insularity. What cultural insularity in the 19th century? That really takes a hit, all right? Just off the top of my head, without anything else, you had the massive urbanization, what you and I learned when we were kids, called the Industrial Revolution, which meant that millions and millions and millions of people throughout the 19th century are moving from the countryside to the city. Mass urbanization. You have the rise of cities in the 19th century, the like of which never existed. Once upon a time, there wasn't no such thing as civil engineering. You couldn't have a whole lot of people in one place for obvious reasons. the old societies were against mass production. They had the guild system and things like this. I can't go through this at great length, but I think many of you know what I'm talking about. You've heard me before. And there was no such thing as raw capitalism, but in the 19th century, you get raw capitalism, in which case, laissez-faire, the state steps aside and says, if you can put enough capital together to open something called a factory, and you can get people to work for a penny a week and produce shoes of whatever quality, and you can mass produce and put it out there, we're going to let you do it. So therefore, I'm going to go and find every hillbilly that I know that'll work for a penny, which there were a zillion of, and because in the countryside, a penny's money, and they'll come to the city, create overcrowded conditions, what you and I, again, using a code word called the sweatshops and that sort of business. And you have, of course, the economic, social crises of the 19th century, which produced socialism as a reaction to Marxism and all the rest of it, because you had the ruthless exploitation of the workers. But what it means for Jews, Orthodox Judaism, and religious Christianity too, was you're moving away from the small community to the large one. What does it have to do with being religious? If you're in a small town, it's like Mayberry, you know? Everybody knows your business. That's the idea of a small community. No such thing as privacy. Everybody knows everything. The lady listens on the phone, you know, all that kind of, the mailman gossips from place to place. There's no such thing as a secret in a small town. How many novels have been written on the basis of that? Right? 1 million novels. Everybody knows everything about everybody. And that's a powerful reinforcer of traditional social roles and religious roles. Get it? You ain't going nowhere. You're going to live in this little village like your parents did. You're going to marry a girl just like your parents did. She's going to act like your mother did, more or less. You're going to act like you did, generation after generation, because there's no room for it. Because the minute you deviate, people are talking and this and that and the other, and it ain't worth it. You always find the rebel. Like I say, you can write a novel about the rebel, but most of the time people are going to conform. Right? They're just going to conform. That's true of Islam, of Christianity, of Judaism, of Hindus. You know, that's how it goes. The small community in and of itself. That's why you have an aged parent. You want them to move to a small community. Because people will know if they don't come to the coffee shop. But when you move to the urban center, nobody knows your name. And you don't know your next door neighbor in the apartment next door. And I don't want to know him because it might be Ted Bundy. Right? And you have what's called, how does C. Wright Mills call it? The lonely crowd. You have the interesting phenomenon in a baseball stadium. You have 50,000 people. They're all packed together in terms of physical proximity, but nobody wants to know who the next person is because, you know, I saw that Alfred Hitchcock movie. You know, I don't want that. Okay? So once you have that, then you have anonymity. And once you have anonymity, that breaks down a lot of the, shall I say, social coercion mechanisms. So if you're in a little town, let's say there are 10 people in the town. How many times can you miss mincha? Where were you yesterday? You know, how often can you be sick? But if you move to a large place, I'd daven somewhere else. I haven't seen you, Mrs. Schwartz, says the kosher butcher in the small town with 20 families. Where have you been? But if she's in Baltimore, Maryland, she can say, I got with someone else, right? And it goes for all the parts of the mikvah, everything, you know, all which used to be the intrusive social controls disintegrate in the 19th century. Okay, I might point out also that totally aside from the immigration, and that took place everywhere. What was the largest Jewish community in Europe in the 18th century? The answer is Brody. How many? Prague. Where I'm going. How many people were in Prague to make it the largest Jewish community in the world? 10,000. That was humongous. Right? 10,000 people. It's like crazy. And that was characteristic of the world. The largest Jewish community in Poland was 7,000 Brody. The Vilna Gaon lived in a town of 4,000 Jews. That's all. Maybe a little less even. It's not what you imagine. Now, that's 1,800. Now let's bring to 1,900. It's about 200,000 in London, similar number in Paris, close to 200,000 in Berlin, well over 200,000 in Vienna. You got 400,000 in Warsaw. You see what I'm talking about? You have 200 and some thousand in Budapest. And if you cross the Atlantic Ocean to some Meshuggah in a place called America, how many people do you have in some Fashnuk in a place called New York City? 2 million Jews? That's crazy. You know what I'm saying? That's crazy. There never was a community. That's why the Jews in America have never been able to create community, because it's too large. And that's it. So we see that all these trends, including the widespread emigration to the West, because there were pogroms in Russia, and all of a sudden everybody moved to America starting in the 1880s, 1890s, and afterwards, a few to Africa. All of a sudden, you're coming to brand new territories. Nobody knows your name. You can make your own life whatever you want. You can be as Jewish or as not Jewish as you wish. So these are all heavy hits on the orthodoxy, to use the term that you're most familiar with. We usually call it traditionalism in the history business. Everything I just said indicates that traditionalism was like a deer in the headlights and therefore went into decadence and decline. They didn't know what we see today in retrospect, which is something we'll be talking about over here in this series, I hope, and that is the absolutely vital importance of chinuch, of what we call today day schools, post-day school type of Jewish education, intensive Jewish education. Anything short of that doesn't work. We've learned that in the last 100 and some years. For some reason, the Jews did not know that and not learn that in the 19th century. I always point out they could have picked it up from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church learned this early on, but the Catholic Church is large, well-financed, and has a priesthood which does nothing but think about the future welfare of the church. So, they don't work. So it's not a put down. I'm just saying, therefore, they can think intelligently about how to create solutions, because the Catholics had the same problem, and they created a whole network of schools of their own from K through Notre Dame, through Fordham, right? As you know, even today, and certainly then when they were set up, you can have a totally fine, actually superior secular education, up to MD, agreed, lawyer, all within a Catholic frame. They did that for that reason. We've done this in the Jewish world since then to a smaller degree, but they didn't even understand this 100 years ago. Okay? All this is subsumed by the title modernity. So when we talk about negotiating the perilous waves of modernity, as I said, that's what I mean. The Orthodox Jews had a hard time. Therefore, the numbers are constantly shrinking. It's a big hemorrhaging all through the 1800s and early 1900s. And because of this decadence, you have in its wake the rise of all different, for the first time ever in Jewish history, the rise of different forms of Judaism, Jewish belief, okay, which is something that didn't exist before. So, for example, Reform Judaism, as the famous Reform professor Michael Meyer called it back in the 70s when he wrote his book on the history of Reform Judaism, Response to Modernity. That's the title, because he's a historian. Okay, Reform Judaism is one response to modernity. It's somewhat played out by now, but it's had its day, right? So it was a response to all this sort of thing. Okay, conservative Judaism in its day was a response to modernity. How do you hold on to nominalism even as you give up fundamentalism? That's what conservative Judaism or liberal Judaism, as they call it in some countries, boiled down to. We have for the first time something that prior to the 1800s would have been an oxymoron: secular Judaism. It's like saying secular Islam. No, Islam's a religion. So can you have secular Judaism? And of two varieties. First of all, an attempt to create an alternative Judaism, like the Wissenschaft des Judentums or the Haskalah or that sort of thing, which is to create a vibrant, strong Jewish culture absent the fundamentalism. This never existed before, but it certainly, as you and I know, became a big idea in the 19th and 20th centuries. Again, it's pretty much played out by now in the year 2019, but it's had its day. Cultural Zionism was the manifestation of this. And then you have secular Judaism B, which has turned out to be bigger than all of them. What is secular Judaism B? Zero. I just don't convert. I'm a secular Jew. What do you do Jewish? Nothing. So I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious. I have nothing to do with Judaism, but I'm not a Christian. I'm talking about a person who did not convert. Right? These notions that I just described, once upon a time, would be an oxymoron. Just like saying I'm a secular Catholic, something like that, It didn't make sense. But it makes sense to you and me. We're familiar with this term. People are like that now. It's a free country. Everybody can do whatever they want. If somebody says, secular Judaism works for me, or something like that, or perhaps I express my Judaism by advocating for this cause or that cause with nothing to do with Judaism whatsoever. That's very popular in America right now, okay? One interesting manifestation of secular Judaism could be BDS, I'm against Israel. That's the way I express my Judaism. What's your problem? I'll tell you what to do. Don't tell me what to do. So these are all brand new phenomena that couldn't have existed until the old started to go into crisis, as I say before. You had this a lot in this really starts in the 19th century. I'm just thinking of Gershon Sholem, who became famous intellectual professor at Hebrew University, come from and he wrote an autobiography, and a totally assimilated German Jewish family, literally 100 years ago, early 1900s, zero. And he asked his father, you don't keep anything, you don't believe in anything, so why are you Jewish? Why don't you just become Christian? I mean, why not? And his father's answer was, one does not abandon a fortress under attack. So, it's interesting. I get it. And there's something to it, but not much. Not much. Okay? If that's what's holding you on, it's interesting, right? I know another case, Luigi Luzzati, who was a Jewish guy, Prime Minister of Italy in 1900, Prime Minister of Italy, and a totally secular guy from Venice. And to be perfectly honest, growing up in Italy, he's so overwhelmed by the culture, he believes in Jesus. He really does, which is often what secular Judaism leads to. And he was asked in Parliament, why don't you convert? He said, I'm ready to convert the day the last anti-Semite drops dead. Which means, same thing. So it's not a matter of, like I say before, it's interesting. It's noble in some weird way, but it's weird, you understand? And by the way, it's not viable. Okay, that's the point, it's not viable. There's also the Haskalah, that we spoke about last year, 2 years ago, which occupies an indeterminate place on the acculturation of fundamentalism spectrum. As I talked about, there are religious maskil, not religious maskil, and this one, the ones who want to really recreate Judaism, ones who just want to pad the existing Judaism with a little bit more. All these are signs either of a decadence or an effervescence, or both at the same time, right? Both at the same time. Now, as I like to do in my talks elsewhere, I like to point out that traditionalism kind of went into crisis and went into decline, kind of fell apart, but very slowly, and was replaced in terms of the fundamentalism and nomism by what's called Orthodox Judaism. That's how the historians look at it, which is the same in many respects, but not in the mentality, because you're now aware that there are other things out there. You're making a conscious choice to do this. It's not like in the old country back in Europe. You keep Shabbos because everybody keeps Shabbos. You go to a Seder on Pesach because what else do you do, right? Nowadays, it's a different story. For the last 100, 200 years, I know I don't have to. I know I don't have to do this. I know I have to do this, right? I know in school they tell me not to believe this. I know this. I choose to do it anyway. So that's a very interesting change in the mentality, okay? And endows what you do with a certain flavor that wasn't there before. And a militant, because then you really have to be countercultural in a way that wasn't necessary before, okay? When one lives in a little bubble, one may be countercultural but not realize it, because everybody in your bubble is the same way, okay? Remember that famous story of Dr. Samuel Johnson back in the 1700s, who goes and visits Aachen, into the spa over there, and he's surrounded by a bunch of little German kids, and they're all yapping away at him. And he said, what are you all saying and all this? And he's saying, they're talking about you. They're saying, you're foreigners. We're not foreigners, we're the English. You're the foreigners. You know what I'm saying? If you live in a little bubble, right, you live in a little shtetl, that's what everybody does. Not when you're quote-unquote Orthodox and living in Berlin or another place, then everybody's driving on the street, and you're different. So it endows it with a different quality. That's how the Jewish historians have come to look at it in the last 60 years. So if you look at it from that point of view, I always like to make the case that 4 successful movements arise out of the dying traditionalism and become the 19th century Orthodoxy, of which 2 will survive the Second World War. But if you look in Europe, first of all, Hasidism. Now, the Hasidic movement didn't arise specifically as a response to modernity, because the Baal Shem Tov lived in the 1700s. He's born in 1698. So it came out of spiritualistic reasons. But the way it grew and developed was in the 1800s, the late 1700s and 1800s. Hasidism is a modern Jewish movement. I know they don't look like it to a lot of people, but no, I'm serious. But that's a shtick. You know what I'm saying? No, let me explain. Chronologically, there never was no such thing as Hasidism before the 1700s. Everybody knows that. There was no such thing as a Rebbe prior to the 1700s. That's a new model. It's actually, when you get to the 1800s, that's a response to modernity. Is it not? You rally around the flag and you batten down the hatches. It's a response, not the only response, it's a response to modernity. And a very powerful one. And from the time Baal Shem Tov died in 1760, from 1760 to 1870, without question, the Hasidic movement expanded. So there were constant conversions to Hasidus, if I can use that expression, all during the time of so-called modernity. Now, it was geographically confined. It happened in one specific place, in Eastern Europe, as we call it, in Ukraine and Poland and Hungary and places like that. That is true. It was confined. It so happened that place had most of the Jews in the world by far. So, I always like to do this in college. Most Jews in the 19th century abandoned the old traditionalism to go to the right, not to the left. You said, what are you talking about? Because all the history books are written from the perspective of the left. Because written from a Westernist perspective. What happened in Germany, what happened in England, what happened in America. And I'm well aware of that. Those are relatively small numbers of Jews. Very large numbers. Went another direction in the 19th century. So that's one. And by the way, by definition, looking sociologically, the Hasidic movement is like tailor-made to fight modernity. If everybody agrees, the only question you got to sign up and agree. But by the way, it's not coercive in the sense that it's voluntary. It's not state power. Okay. So if you sign up to agree, then if the Rebbe says this and this, that's what you do, and you don't care what anybody else says. Well, if you buy into that, it's very effective. Okay. And it was certainly the most effective of the four trends that I'm speaking about, and we will certainly encounter this in the First World War. So the Hasidic movement was in constant expansion mode till around 1870, whereupon it kind of plateaued. And then it didn't expand anymore, but it kind of stayed the same, meaning they have a lot of kids, so even though they lost some to modernity, they kind of made it up with extra babies. That's, to put it in simple terms. Okay? So that's the period of 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, all the rest of it. We do have plenty of Hasidic people that leave, but you also have new ones coming aboard. And we will encounter, for example, the Ger Rebbe during the First World War. He has 100,000 Hasidim in Poland under German occupation. That's 100,000 people that are ready to, Simon says. That's a lot of people. And he's only one Rebbe. The biggest, but there are many others. So, this is in the teeth of modernity. Right? This is in the teeth of modernity. This is with the urbanization and Karl Marx and all the rest of it. So Hasidism is one. The Hasidic movement, we can't even speak of a Hasidic movement. It's radically decentralized not long after the death of the Baal Shem Tov, certainly after the Magen HaMezritch. And everybody knows there's all kinds of different groups. That was, of course, a powerful strength. Decentralization meant, you can't crush it. You do it here, then one pops up over here. And it's very interesting, in the 19th century, in the century prior to the First World War, the Russian government wanted to crush the Hasidism. And after a while, they kind of sort of they never formally gave up, but they kind of gave up. Not many people know this. By the late 1800s, the Lubavitch was tight with the government in the sense that they knew how to bribe and get and lobby, whatever the right people, and they get what they want. Okay? Now, of course, there were gezeros and all kind of laws on the books, and there's no question about that. But they were able to maneuver within it. Right? And that's in a very, very anti-Semitic government environment. So the Hasidic movement held on, even under these czars, Nicholas I, Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II, all of whom were very, very anti-Semitic and certainly hated Hasidism. And then the other large area of the Hasidic movement, the only other country it spilled into, was the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which no longer exists, of course, this is Eastern Europe, and this is where the Hasidim, the Baal Shem Tov started here in the Ukraine. Eventually it spread through most of this area, okay? Primarily Ukraine and Poland. Lubavitch is in the Belarus and a few others. Lubavitch means Belarusian Hasidism, right? And Lithuania was less. There was some in Lithuania also. Not everybody knows this stuff, but that's what it is. Slonim, yeah, but there certainly were the Karlin in there. The other place was it spilled over the border into, here's Russia, into here. Galicia and Hungary, where I'm pointing over here, Eastern Hungary. It's called Unterland. These are the places that many Jews immigrated to from these Hasidic areas, and many Jews converted to Hasidism, if I can use that term, during the course of the 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, many. Okay. Now, therefore, when we'll be talking in my mini series here this week, talking about the Jews in Russia and Jews in Austria-Hungary, is a very large Hasidic component to both sides. And Galicia was like a happy hunting ground for the Hasidim. One of the reasons was that until 1850 or so, the regime was very anti-Hasidic and tried to suppress it. After 1850, they kind of gave up and said, we got so many problems on our hands. The Orthodox Jews, the Jews in general are not the problem. We have to worry about the Jews are not trying to overthrow the government. They're not trying to set up their own state. They're not trying to do this kind of stuff. And so leave them the heck alone. And that is the era of the Emperor Franz Joseph, right? Here he is. There's actually the Pressburger Rav, he's not a chassid, but it looks like it. Visiting Pressburg, being Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, the former capital of Hungary, the head of the big yeshiva there. This is the grandson of the Chassam Sofer. If you can make it out, from my angle, I can't see it, but that's who it is. I think they call him the Das Sofer. And he got along very well with them. And he was very beloved by them because he left them alone like Greta Garbo. That's mamish what it was. They just want to do their own thing, live their own lives, not bother anybody. They do report to the army. They do pay the taxes. Of course, everybody cheats. This is Europe, In Baltimore, we know nothing of this, but right. But in Europe, but within that framework, they got after 1850, they just changed the policies, and you could more or less live a fully Jewish life. Let me explain what I mean. You got hired by a government. The discrimination was not in practice. As we will see, by the time we get to the First World War, Jews, not from Jews, but Jews, could be officers and generals even in the Austro-Hungarian army. There were many positions that were open to them. There were some that weren't, but it was pretty doggone liberal as far as anti-Semitism is concerned. Okay? I wouldn't say necessarily the Austro-Hungarian was the most liberal place that ever lived, but I'm speaking about from the Jewish perspective, and particularly from the Orthodox Jewish perspective, which is why Franz Joseph became a very beloved figure. The Jews called him Akiro, the emperor, the emperor you always find in all the rabbinic literature, the Shalos and Shuvas, always references to the Kiro, which is a Caesar Yomro, the emperor, may his majesty be exalted. Or, as the Jews said, in Galicia, they said, the Hasidim, when they made a mistake, you make a prayer for the government and all that. So instead of Franz Joseph, the son of Ephraim Karl, I said it myself, Franz Joseph, the son of the Archduke Franz Karl, is Ephraim Yosef Mishraga Feivel, right? Which was an endearment. You know, and by the way, somebody told the emperor about it. There's always a Jew like that. And he says, I know they don't make bad. Which made him better, So, the Hasidic movement was, as I said before, fairly untrammeled, shall we say, in the fin de siècle, in the years before the First World War. Although it was becoming increasingly difficult to be culturally insular in Europe. It wasn't the internet at that time. We started the newspapers, the telegraph, and all that kind of stuff. And that's an interesting discussion by itself. Will take us too far away. That was one. The second of all of these four trends or strategies was in Germany. You and I know this term, Derek, it's the neo-Orthodoxy, as they refer to it. Here's the Germany of yesteryear. before Second World War when the Allies chopped off this and gave this to Poland. This no longer is part of Germany. But that time it was. And the German Empire was like 80 million with 600,000 Jews, 15% of whom were Orthodox. Here the ideology was very strongly argued over. I think people know that. And two trends emerged in terms of neo-Orthodoxy in the 19th century. One is Samson Raphael Hirsch, the one is Israel Hildesheimer, Frankfurt, Berlin. And these are the two charismatic and dynamic figures who emerged, who represented a model of being very, very frum on the one hand, but Europeanizing on the other, whether in dress or knowledge of language, education, things of that nature. In other words, they were willing to make, which by frum standards would be quite a large appropriation of European culture. Now they would say it's not a large appropriation of European culture; it's a highly selective, very small one. And there you get your big egg and small egg arguments. But that's what happened. Now Hirsch was a big fighter and was very fiercely ideological, anti-reform, and he made all these big splashes. I think everybody knows in the 19th century. So it wasn't simply about being Europeanized and modern, but it's also with a very strong ideological edge. And Rav Hildesheimer was not that way. He had a separate kehillah. He was very frum, and he was totally opposed to non-Orthodox Judaism, all the rest of it, but had a much more, shall we say, pragmatic and mild kind of a personality. And the way I always like to say it is like this. Rav Hirsch said, you're not allowed to join any other Jews in anything unless absolutely necessary. Like for Hatzal or something. Otherwise than that, you should have 2 JCCs, 2 cemeteries, 2 sets of schools, 2 hospitals, and all the rest of it. That they really did. And Rav Hildesheimer said, I think you should always join all the other Jews, except when it's not possible. He said, no, you can't have joint religious services, unfortunately, because they just see different. But where it is possible, you can. So that means that what they call neo-Orthodoxy was enough of a vibrant trend to have a right wing and a left wing. In the 19th century, they commanded 15% of German Jewry. So 85% was not Orthodox, 15% were Orthodox, which by European standards is pretty big. Let me put it this way. I don't think today there are 15% of American Jewry is Orthodox, but maybe recently it's become because of the demography. So that's a fairly high standard for the 1800s. But they died. By the time you get to the late 1800s, 1890s, all the rest of it, so they're no longer here. Hildesheimer, I think, had Alzheimer's the last 5-10 years of his life. So he was out of it, in the 90s. But until then, these people were very vigorous and they had a tremendous charisma. I can't overemphasize this. Rav Hirsch, Hildesheimer, some of these other people, the Würzburger Rav, had a tremendous personal magnetism and charisma. Their successors not. And that's often what happens. And so by the time you get to the First World War, you have people like Rab Breuer, who was not Hirsch, right? You have W.C. Hoffman, who was a very great man, but he didn't have the charisma of Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer. To be the first one to say it. Okay, a very great person. Here's Rabbi Aaron Troy from Munich. Most people haven't even heard of him. He was a very chashuv Rab once upon a time, and all the rest of it. But he wasn't, like these types. You see. And so therefore, Orthodox Jewry in Germany was considered somewhat plateaued and stagnant in the years prior to the First World War. It's very interesting. And being that they're Western, they already had self-awareness and they were always writing about their problems over here. Because they're epigons, they're just the followers of the original great ones, and they felt it. But German Jewry still had the old virtues. I always like this story. This is Mayor Berlin, Bar-Ilan, the founder of the Mizrahi movement, one of them. And this is Mayor Hildesheimer, the son of Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer. He was not the Gaon, his father was, but he was a big lobbyist for Jewish causes in Imperial Germany and afterwards in Weimar Germany, a very successful one also. The Orthodox Jew as a lobbyist for Jewish causes is very important because they pass laws against Shechita otherwise, they pass laws against Bris Milah otherwise, they pass all kinds of things if you let them. So you have to know how to lobby German bureaucrats, you get it? So he was a great man in that what we call Ascon. Huh? And Mayor Berlin wrote a famous biography called "Von Volozhin bis Yerushalayim." His years from traveling as a young child in Volozhin to eventually ending up in Jerusalem, headed the Mizrahi Party, and it's a wonderful book. It should be translated. And he says that he was from Russia, and he came as a young boy. His mother took him after his father died when he was 11 or 12 years old to Germany. And he's not used to the cleanliness and the order and the shul, and you see young ladies in synagogue, and they totally blew him away, the culture and the modernity of it. And he came back as a young man of about 20, 22, as an important Zionist leader, and he said he wanted to meet Hildesheimer to talk to him about Zionism because he was not Zionist. If you were a right-wing from Germany, you don't believe in Zionism. You believe in Israel, but not in Zionism. And he said, where am I going to find him? He went to his house, so he's always running off to lobbying in this government ministry, in the parliament, and this, that, and the other. But they said like this. He's a German Jew, Central European Jew, so every day at 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, he's at Starbucks. You see? He's got his coffee shop. This is what you do. You take off an hour with your cronies. Remember at college, the newspapers before the internet, that they used to stick on those wooden things? Right? So if it's Berlin or Central Europe, you got 20 newspapers from every country in Europe. You follow? In German and French and English and so on and so forth. You read the papers, you hawk, for an hour, and then you go on your business, right? So if you go to this and this Starbucks, you'll find him there. And he said he went to this place, and he waited an hour, and he wasn't there. So he went to the German head waiter with the handlebar mustache and the, like the Hollywood outfit with the tucks and the tails. And he says, in German, he says, this, where the boy's Dr. Hildesheimer, where is he? I come to talk to the waiter looks at him. He said, well, he's not coming today. Why not? It's Bahab. Somebody don't even tell me. There's an old custom that nobody keeps today that they fast on the Monday, following the Shol Shvagam, following the holidays. He's a German Jew. He's a modern guy. He's doctor. He had a PhD, all the rest of it. The Yekashiv virtues. You understand? Said he still had those sorts of things. But on the other hand, they had feelings of inferiority and inadequacy in the fantasy ekla because they didn't have yeshivas. And they write about it all the time. I tell you again, they're self-aware. There's a wonderful book, let's go to the next one, that everybody should read, called Modernity Within Tradition, The Social History of Orthodox Jewry Imperial Germany. It's very, very well done by Mordechai Breuer. And he nobody knows because he's from them. He's a Breuer. He passed away not long ago. He was a historian at the Hebrew University. He didn't start out that way, though. And he really describes very wonderfully this world of Torah Derech Eretz. And where it worked, where it didn't work, all the rest of it, he gives a lot of attention to the fact, as he knows from his babyhood and growing up, the people always writing we don't have Talmidei Chachamim, we don't have serious learning, we don't have this and this, and in other countries they do, and what's wrong with us, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting. I'm going to move on because of time. The third place, so that's two. It's Hasidism, it's German Neo-Orthodoxy. You have Hungary. Once upon a time, before the First World War, look how big Hungary was. Like 5 or 6 times it is today, maybe more. This is Hungary. Today, most of this is Romania and Slovakia and Croatia and all that stuff. There's one big blob called the Kingdom of Hungary, which no longer exists. And the Kingdom of Hungary had close to 1 million Jews, 900,000, once upon a time. So it's big. And in Hungary, you had a very sharp division between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox. They got divorced in 1871. After a whole bunch of political happenings, the law was passed that there are 2 religions in Hungary. The Jewish religion and the Orthodox Jewish religion. And so really there they really had, wherever they were able to, 2 hospitals, 2 cemeteries, 2 ambulances, 2 JCCs, 2 baseball teams, you name it. You understand? That was like a principle with them, wherever they were able to do it. And you ain't seen nothing until you've seen a Hungarian classic Kehillah, which is organized, makes the Yekkes look like losers. They're very tightly and very well organized, okay? The charity, the building, the this, that, and the other, very, very well done, if you like that. In Hungary, the Judaism, it was half and half. It was 800,000 or 850,000, 50% of whom were Orthodox, 50% were not. And really, it was kind of a divorce. It's not good, but this is what happens. And the reason they're able to hold on to such a large percentage, because what I like to call the Hungarian archipelago. They had archipelago of yeshivas. The Chassam Sofer, back in the early 1800s, set up a big yeshiva. That's the Chassam Sofer. This, in his old age, this is a new picture of his wife. Just came out. This is Mrs. Chassam Sofer. Yeah. Yeah. Well, she's the daughter of Rabbi Kiva. He was a second wife. He was married, his wife died. He was 50, she was 20. She was a widow. Her husband died when he was 19. She was a widow. They got married, they had 11 children. Yeah, he had no children from the first wife. It's a very dramatic story. And they were happily married. I know they're happily married because I read a book and it says like this: "Don't ask me any shalas. My wife kicked me out of the house because she's cleaning for Pesach and she won't let me take any books with me." So that shows that they're happily married. I'm happily married. Anyway, wait a second. So the Chassam Sofer basically, in terms of what we're talking about, set up a system in Pressburg, and it was copied by many, many of his students and followers. They built these yeshivas, large and small, and some have more scholarship, less scholarship. But the main point is, by putting a kid through this, you're going to brainwash them to become Orthodox, okay? Especially the teenage years. And he wouldn't use the terms that I just used, but that's what it boiled down to. And since everybody who was a rabbi in Hungary wanted to be like him in this regard, you had dozens and dozens of yeshivas, some very large, some very small. And this is what literally raised generations. Because he died in 1839, and here we are now in 1914. In addition to that, the Hasidic movement moved to Hungary. So they're even to the right of what I just spoke about. Hence, you have a large, staunchly Orthodox element. And I'm saying with my fist, because the Hungarian Orthodoxy, growing up in the way that I just described, had a militancy to it. That's where then the Torah Kartni and others come from today. The Satmar is a stark. You understand? And in the other 50%, assimilation was rampant. Among the non-religious, the intermarriage rate, the assimilation was crazy in Hungary. Crazy. So you had one side like this and the other side in a state of decay. That's what Hungary was like. And they also were rather isolated. They regarded themselves as not having to do with the German Jews, not having to do with the Lithuanian Jews and the other Jews. They said, we can handle our own things ourselves. It's a whole story by itself. And finally, the fourth would be in Lithuania, where they had the Lithuanian yeshivas, which is a tiny element which proved to be capable of resisting modernity, especially in the yeshivas before the fin de siècle. In the 19th century, you had the old yeshiva of Volozhin, which was traditionalist and non-Orthodox. They weren't militant as we understand it today. They're just about learning. And of course, they're very frum and all the rest of it. But you had maskilim there, so to speak, and you had all kinds of things going on. But the main point is they believe, as we would say, they Torah only, and that will, how shall I say, cover all sins. And it's an approach, and it certainly was a very, very famous and highly regarded place in its day. But that's not the Lithuanian yeshivas that you and I are thinking about. Rather, it's the Musar yeshivas that arose in the late 1800s. And that's the yeshivas that we think of when we talk about today, because these were the incubators of Orthodoxy and not traditionalism. The Musar yeshivas started in the 1880s. The Musar movement is associated with Yisrael Salanter, but he didn't go around spreading it in that way. He died in 1881 or 1882. Upon his death, a number of his students and disciples and people like that undertook, as an anti-modernity ideological measure, to try and introduce Musar into Lithuanian yeshivas, so there shouldn't be just learning, but should also be Musar. The usual translation is ethics, but that doesn't do any justice to the theme. Especially in the late 19th century, it's your Shemayim, ideology, stay strong, don't listen to these other things out there, it's all the devil talking, that kind of thing, okay? And there was a brief pulmus on Musar. It was a small spat, where some people didn't like that, but by the time you get to 1900, the triumph of Musar as an ideological component of all the yeshivas is a fact. And in the fin de siècle, especially in the Russian Empire, the yeshivas and everybody else was in an era of ideology. The non-religious were into ideology, the secular were into ideology, so the yeshivas now have to have an ideology for it also. So it's not just learning. The yeshivas in Lithuania, as small as they are, become their own subculture, a kind of Hasidic world of Hasidism. And it's very interesting. Here, let's go to the next one. These are famous, these are not Hasidic. These are Lithuanian Rosh Yeshivas and Rabbanim. But it's like an alternative Hasidic universe. They have strong followers, right? Not the same way. In Hasidic, you can't ever criticize the top person. Here you can, but you know, there's certain deference. It's a certain kind of a very interesting world, different than today. And my goodness, this is the founder of TELS. Here's the Shimon Shkab, here's the Baruch Ber Leibowitz, here's the Alter Slobodka. Very famous. The fact that I can just rattle these names off means that they developed a charismatic following within a tiny group, but very intense. And this is exactly happening in the 20 years before the First World War. I would even go so far as to say that people saw this the only vibrant element within contemporary Orthodoxy. They saw it, everything else is decadent and in decline. Let's go to the next one. The job of the Rabbonim, of the rabbinate, shifted, the more imaginative ones, to supporting the yeshivas. What is your job as a rabbi? It's, of course, you have to preside over the community and do all the regular old-fashioned stuff, but by the time you get to 1900, 1910, their main job is to foster and support the yeshivas. This is Reb Chaim Brisker. He was the rabbi of the city of Brisk. He wasn't a Rosh Yeshiva. But he said the main thing is to foster the flame of the yeshiva world. Here's Reb Chaim Grzhenski, who was like the rabbi of Vilna. Same thing. Who's this over here? I can't even see. Here's the Chavetz Chaim, right? From that movie they just recently discovered. And do you all know what I'm talking about? Go online. You're all living in the moon. About a year ago, I think, or 2 years ago, they found a clip that some news operation did back in 1923 when they had the Knesset HaGadola in Vienna, some American news operation, and they just did some clip to show in the movie theaters, like they used to show movie things long ago, and they ended up not doing it, you know, because things get cut, or maybe they showed it somewhere, or ultra-Orthodox Jews gather in Vienna, something like that, for the Aguda convention, and it was in the University of North Carolina freezer, you know, for like decades. And recently it was discovered and put online, and you actually see the Chavetz Chaim and people like this walking around in Vienna, you know, and you don't have to imagine anymore what it's like. So this was a wildfire in my community. Anyway, but the point's again, what's the purpose of these people? It's not simply give speeches, not to provide over life cycle events, not all the rest of it. It's to foster yeshivas. Because it's the only thing that's going to work. The only thing that's going to work. This was different than the communal rabbinate used to be long ago, but this is the way it is in the period I'm talking about. Until the 1905 Russian Revolution, there was a big revolution in Russia in 1905, which almost overthrew the Tsar, but didn't. Okay? Until that time, the yeshivas were under tremendous pressure from Bundists, Marxists, Zionists, and assorted maskilim. There was a pretty heavy hemorrhage because a lot of people are caught up in the world of ideas. And ideas that seem to us today like crazy. How could you give all this up to be a Bundist? You understand? Or how can somebody give all this idea to be a Yiddishist? Or all this sort of stuff. At that time, had a tremendous attraction. And people would come off the street in there and say, what are you wasting your time learning over here? Come with me. And a lot of them did. There was a steady hemorrhaging. But in 1905, the Russian Revolution did not work, and it was followed by a reaction. That's a European word, capital R, right? Here's the Tsar's reaction. Here's Nicholas. Here's Rashkovsky. Not the one from Baltimore. This Rashkovsky, he's the son of a gun that wrote the Protocols of Zion. He's head of the Tsar's secret police dirty tricks bureau. Okay? Here's Peter Stolypin, who was the only intelligent prime minister under Nicholas II, and therefore the Reds assassinated him because they didn't like the fact he's intelligent. Understand? And here these guys were working to bring about a right-wing reaction against revolutionaryism, and therefore became much more police-dominated, police state, and ain't got no Bundists running around the street waving anything in any yeshivas. They didn't get in trouble. Same thing with Marxists. They go underground. So ironically, that was good for the yeshivas. Okay? And as a result, from 1905 on, for the next 9 years, you see, I'll tell you something that nobody knows. Ufaratsto. The Lithuanian yeshivas started new branches all over the Pale Settlement in places very far away from Lithuania. In Ukraine, obviously in Belarus, in Poland, places that had nothing to do with Litvichkeit. The Lumji Yeshiva is one that comes to mind, but many others. And you see, it was like an expansive mode. It's the only Orthodox movement that's an expansive mode in the fin de siècle. It's very interesting in that regard. You know, they haven't seen their day. They're not self-aware and arguing over whether they're in decline or something like that. The opposite. In yeshiva, the only way you get a job is you marry somebody's daughter. Therefore, I'll go and I'll make my own yeshiva somewhere else. Gesundheit. Right? Gesundheit. And they do it. But they're all saturated around here, so I'll go 100 miles there, 200 miles there. And as a result, you begin to see the spreading. I'm describing a phenomenon that you and I live with today. Okay? What I just described has been happening the last 50 years in our lifetime. Well, you start with near Israel, but all of a sudden then you got Schlanger, then you got this one, you got this one. That's just in Baltimore and elsewhere, you see? It's a phenomenon. It shows you the bolt is not shot. Right? I don't see too many reform seminaries opening up. You see my point. It spread, whatever the weird circumstances, expansion seems to be a sign of health. That's my point. The only vibrant Orthodox phenomenon, but there you have it. And as I said before, the pattern was set till today. Not that the yeshiva is not impacted by European culture, they certainly are. Here's the yeshiva boy with the Panama hats. You're not going to see too many people in their Israel walking around a Panama hat today. Something like that, right? Look like Fred Astaire, But George M. Cohan. But not in the essentials. That's what they'll say. They say, maybe I'm wearing a seersucker suit, but I know the Ketsos by heart. You see? And they're not in the essentials. Matter of fact, this is the golden era in which they eschewed externals and concentrated the internals. When I was a kid, not today, Rabbi Oberstern will confirm, if you were in there, you didn't have a beard. You understand? Who are you to have a beard? Rabbi Ruderman could have a beard. Who are you to have a beard? Do you get what I'm saying? It's like, and what are you showing off? Yeah. Who are you walking around some dude in some long coat? Who the heck are you? Who made you anything? You get it? Now today it's been Hasidicized, so it's different. But I'm talking about once upon a time. And so that's what you had 100 years ago. But there wasn't a modernity feeling of its own. In the strange way, the yeshivas in the fin de siècle modeled the German research institutes were the highest institutions of European high educational culture, scientific culture. Even though it's weird to say that, but nevertheless, you see this pattern. It's expressed, for example, out with the old books. The Marsha, the Tzlach, and Urim Batumim, and names like this, which used to be staples, are dropped from the Lithuanian Yeshiva curriculum. It's funny. You understand? Instead, you have new books. Let's go to the next one. You have the Ketsos, the Shar Yosher, the Rebbe Kiva Eger. I know these names don't mean a lot to everybody, but they'll mean to some. And all I'm trying to say is like this. Of course, everything's holy, but we do something different. We read different books. We analyze things in different ways. And that makes you feel modern. Because nobody else did it before. Okay? They have new styles of learning. These people may look to, these are the old school, the Noda Yehuda, or Rabbi Yonas Eibshitz, all this. I kind of like it, but no. That style is out. Okay? Again, I'm sure not everybody understands what I'm talking about. But just take it from me. That style is out. These people, even though they look old, are actually new. Shimon Shkop, the Meir Simcha, Chaim Brisker. I know to American, I get it. But nevertheless, you can either take my word for it or not. They represent a brand new cutting-edge way of looking at the Talmud that has captured the imagination of thousands of people till today, around the world. Wherever you have these yeshivas, in America, in England, in South Africa, in Israel, and I don't know where, these are the things that are hot today, right? What about the old books? That's good too, like you would say today, an old history book, but this is what's in now. So all of which means that you have a feeling of being different and a feeling of being innovative. And if you have a feeling of being different and innovative, that's all that matters, because it's subjective. Okay? And this fans the carefully cultivated elitism, which is fanned by the yeshiva leaders. So I don't care what anybody else thinks. If you're in part of this world, and this person doesn't learn, you just feel so elitist, that nobody else knows this, and you do. And therefore you look down, because what is any elite all about? It's about looking down on the others. What does a MD do after he gets a degree? What does a lawyer do after he gets a degree? What can we say, like that, okay? So therefore, within this subculture and a little bit outside of it in Russian Jewry, the yeshiva student, who used to be looked at some loser, within these carefully cultivated circles now has the dignity of a European university student, which is why they want to dress that way, right? Like we saw before. All right? The scholarly atmosphere of pure research is imitative here because the yeshivas, the Lithuanian yeshivas aren't into halacha l'maisa, as everybody knows. They're not into practical law. You know, you tell a regular layperson, what are you going to be a rabbi for? It's like being trained to know the law, so you can be a rabbi of a congregation. Guy said, rabbi of a congregation, who the heck wants that? Well, then what are you studying for? Not to be a rabbi of a congregation with a bunch of idiots. You see, like that. So, then what is it all about? You know, I know you don't get it. You know, you see what I'm saying? It's a very interesting, attitude. You know, to look over the eyeglasses like this. And really, what you're doing is who pursues pure scholarly research? The German Research Institute, right? The German Research Institutes, okay? And they are the ones that are they're doing the cutting edge in new science, in new ways of looking at law, in new ways of doing history, in new ways of humanities. So they would never use the language I'm using. And this is my perspective looking back over 100 years. But to me, it's as plain as the day. Okay? And all I can ever share is my opinion. That's all I said. Right? This, by the way, it's the research in abstractions in high university. Like you want to do medical research, you want to do with the world, not of the practical, but the new. These are, this is student dignity. I won't go into this now. Let's go to the next one. The hour's late. No, you know. Since she's laughing, I'll go back to it. Let's go back. I want to tell you, no, wait, I'll make a point. Hungary, Lithuania. Listen to me. Dushinsky, Nitziv. Big Rosh Yeshiva in Hungary, big Rosh Yeshiva in Lithuania, Volozhin. This person, Moshe Blau, visits Europe and writes memoirs about what he witnessed. He goes to this yeshiva in Hungary, very old school, and somebody wasn't davening properly, and the Rosh Yeshiva, this is Hungary, the Rosh Yeshiva calls him over and slaps him publicly. And this is Hungary. What you do is, and then you kiss the hand of the person that slapped you, because that's the culture in Hungary. And that's just the way it goes, right? Used to be like that long ago in the fancy English schools, long ago. A year or two apart, somebody does something that really ticks off the Netziv. I think he shaved off his payas or something. He lost his temper so much, he slapped the boy. The whole yeshiva went on strike. And it was a very hard situation. And he couldn't back off because of his position, and they wouldn't back off. And he had a material for a novel. And in the end, some clever diplomat, some Henry Kissinger, worked out. He didn't apologize exactly, but he didn't, like that. What does it tell you? This is not some place for little kids where you can slap people. That's why I'm student dignity. That's what I'm trying to say. You get it? It goes with the pure research, it goes with everything else. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, this is also very interesting. The Musar movement that I'm talking about actually turned a very humanist direction, which is very modern and European. In classic Jewish texts, it's about God. If anybody knows anything about the Lithuanian Musar movement, Navardik, Kelm, Slobodka, what's it all about? The human. What drives you? How do you conquer anger? Or can one conquer anger? How does one deal with jealousy? How does one self-analyze? It's a humanistic. It's very European. Okay? Now, you never had this in the old Sparm. Now, of course, they're not saying, well, we're going to be humanistic, but you see it. At least to me, it's fascinating. And there's even unconscious Freudism. It's good, right? What do I mean? You ever read Yisrael Salanter? What's he talking about? The Kochos Hakeim, the dark forces of the subconscious? Now that I told you, you can go look it up. What really underlies people's motives? What's in there? Now, he's not a Freudian, but you find somebody in the 19th century, the founder of the Muslim movement, totally preoccupied with, and he was very, very spiritual, but he's totally preoccupied with man. And I mean, in Freud's sense, man up here. What's really happening, right? And just as a psychiatrist might say, you're worried about this, but here's really the problem. So a Musarist would say, you think this is your problem, but this is the problem. It's fascinating, okay? At least that's my argument tonight. All right, let me roll on and finish this. The growing gap between the yeshiva scholar and the broad public out there is just a major factor to fantasy echo. The public is becoming less religious, the yeshiva is becoming more intense. The growing absence of the middle mediating class of the scholarly balabas that used to exist once upon a time intensifies the elitist gap between the yeshiva student and the masses, the hamonam, like we talked about before. How do they manage to afford these kind of institutions? They got a rich family that bankrolls it. T. Wysotsky, Colin Wysotsky, controlled 35% of the Russian tea market. How much do you think? Because no coffee in Russia, it's all tea, right? From Kamchatka to Finland, it's a third of the doggone market. Tell me how rich he was. Okay? And by the way, poor boy from a Lithuanian family, grew up barefoot, spent 5 years trying to learn in Volozhin Yeshiva. They say you can't cut it, that's what they say. Can't cut it. But he didn't have hard feelings. And eventually, it's a long story, but what's the expression, all the tea in China? Well, he came close to it, and he was loaded, and he was a generous guy, and he bankrolled a lot of these institutions I'm talking about, the Volozhin Yeshiva, the Slobodka Yeshiva, the Telza Yeshiva, and all this sort of thing, and in a time that most millionaires didn't. And he left this to, his daughters were like that, not his son, right? He had like 3 daughters, and they were a patron of the yeshiva. Not only yeshiva, Zionism, Haram. From his will, they built a technion. Okay? There's all kind of very interesting sorts of things over there. Let's go to the next one. His daughter, Mrs. Grabowski, her husband was a nobody, but she bankrolled. You know what a kibbutz is? The Israelis stole the term. What is a kibbutz really? Before it was used as a collective form. A kibbutz is a group of advanced yeshiva students who don't need the framework of a yeshiva anymore. They'll just go and hang out with a certain rabbi and they'll talk at a high level and they don't need schedules and all the rest of it because they're the better students. You understand? And so there was a Ritzel Aponovitcher once upon a time, a very famous Russian yeshiva type, a genius, and Mrs. Grabowski said, I'm going to pay, you should just have an elite group in Panovich and you learn away and all this kind of stuff. And she did it until the communists took over. Okay, there were others. She had a brother-in-law, Gotts. There's a whole story to this kind of business. I'll tell you a good story, even though I shouldn't take up the time. But I'll tell you a good story. The Alter of Navardik, who, if anybody knows who that is, one of the Musarists that I'm talking about, one of the Shiva heads, who was known to be a wild and crazy guy on purpose, and ruthless Musa, like, why are you wearing that jewelry? Why are you doing this? And, I know what's really happening, and no respect for bourgeois conventions. It's part of the mystique of the Navardic movement. No respect for bourgeois conventions. He goes to see Vysotsky, and he doesn't ring the bell all the way. Just opens the door, walks in with his muddy boots all over the fancy carpets, sits down on the leather fancy sofa. Wysotsky comes in and he starts screaming at him, Geld, Geld, Geld. All I see here is Geld. What are you going to do for the next world? All this stupid money. And Wysotsky's so shaken up, he gives him a blank check. It's a true story. He says, sign a check. He said, you fill it out. So then another, this news travels. Somebody from another yeshiva came, much more dignified, all the rest. He rang the bell, he did all the nice things. He spoke with the missus and so on and so forth, and he gave him a small check. And he said, why? He said, the other guy made me feel the non-value of money. I want to get rid of it. I want some olam haba. So I said, take it all. You obviously, if you were nice enough to shine your shoes before you walked in, it's not because I'm a pretty boy. Because I got this. If that's it, I'm going to hold on to it. So that's that world. Anyway, but I'll say again, let's go to the next one. They funded Haram. In fact, that's how he made a living. He worked in their tea company. It was the antithesis of Orthodox Judaism. He's the great opponent ideologically, the champion of cultural Zionism. He's an atheist, let's be frank about it, okay? And all of his projects are also funded by the Vysotskys. So this is the crazy world of the years before the war. All these institutions didn't know it, but my friends, they were about to find themselves very shortly on the front lines of the Eastern Front, on the battle lines. The reason they didn't know it is for over a century, these have been a zone of peace. Look at this. Here's Eastern Europe. Germany, Poland, Austria-Hungary. There's three countries, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia. Used to be Prussia, right? From 1814 to 1914, there were no wars. There were no wars in Europe. There was a little war between England and France and a little war here. But here, these three countries never went to war with each other, even before 100 years. So that means that with all the stuff and junk that was going to Eastern Europe, it was a peace. You know how precious peace is? Do you know how precious peace is? For all people, not only for the Jews, for the Poles, for the Ukrainians, for the Lithuanians, for the Germans, and so on and so forth. For 100 years, you could go across the border, back and forth, you could do business, life went on, and so on and so forth. The reason there was a zone of peace is the three dynasties that ruled these territories, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, the Romanov families in Russia, you've heard these names, had much in common, and for a century they didn't make war on each other. They were smart enough to do that. All three dynasties were very conservative. All three benefited from the partition of the Kingdom of Poland. The three of them together had wiped out Poland. Let's go back one. This used to be all of Poland, but Russia took this part, Germany took this part, and Austria took that part. And therefore, like three fat thieves. Why should we quarrel with each other? You understand? They're all doing very well. All of them benefited from mutual trade because it's a natural zone. That's the next one. John Maynard Keynes famously said in the Economic Council of the Queens, he says the Central Europe and Eastern Europe is one big zone. They've got the wheat, they got the oil, they got the this, that. It's a natural market. And so for 100 years of peace, there was constant commercial intercourse, of which the Jews played a very important part, by the way. Moving things from one place to another. And it was I won't say a prosperity, but it was a kind of prosperity of once upon a time. Certainly was looked at as the good old days. Actually, Austria and Russia had never in history gone to war, if you follow that sort of thing. Prussia had gone to war against Russia once, back in what they call the 7 Years' War, if you're a buff for the European history. Let's go to the next one. There's the Battle of Kunersdorf, when Frederick the Great was badly defeated. It's very well known, right? That's the last time they fought, Russia, okay? And so, wise statesmen knew this, and they worked hard to prevent friction between the three powers. So that's who Metternich was, and that's who Bismarck was, right? No wars between Austria, Germany, Russia. Just do that, and everything will be stable. Just avoid that, right? Metternich was wiser. Metternich said, I don't need to get more territory and get anybody ticked off, just keep everybody happy. Bismarck was pretty astute, but he wasn't astute enough. He couldn't keep his hands off of things. He left a precarious situation, a permanently angry France, and it required astute juggling to prevent France and Russia from allying. There was a war between Bismarck and France, and they beat the French, and instead of just leaving them with everything, they took Alsace-Lorraine away, and they made France permanently angry. It was not smart. You see, that was the cancer. The successors of Bismarck were not capable. They allowed two things to happen. They allowed Germany to become estranged from Russia, right? So even though the Kaiser met the other one, this is the idiot, William II, who got rid of Bismarck, who was the only smart guy. It's a famous cartoon, getting rid of the pilot. So how are you going to steer the boat? Right? And what was Bismarck's genius? No war with Russia. Keep friends with Russia under all conditions. And then Austria became estranged from Russia. Let's go to the next one. And Franz Josef was not very, he was a nice guy, but he was very, very not smart. And he allowed the friendship with Russia to deteriorate. By 1914, the long peaceful ground of Eastern Europe was starting to burn under the feet of the inhabitants, including the Jews, but nobody realized it in the summer of 1914, but they soon would. One last point, these years saw the rise of, and I'll just do this very briefly, these last years saw the rise of a Jewish politics, okay? I'm talking about Klal Yisrael level. Until the fin de siècle, the Jewish people never had a political identity as a Jewish people. Okay? Let's go to the next one. Herzl changed that. When he set up the Zionist movement, even if it was smoke and mirrors, which it was, and even if it was a bluff, nevertheless, he put together a show in which you see a Zionist Congress in which there are Jews from every country coming together and discussing the future of the Jewish people as a people. And that means that the Jews now, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the years before the First World War, are saying, we want to enter the community of nations as a nation. It was unprecedented. Okay? So that means you're starting to have the beginnings of Jewish, what shall I say, nationalism, which was almost once an oxymoron. And the Zionist Congresses and movement made such a good impression on the Orthodox that they split in reaction to this. It was a big challenge to cultural insularity. So on the one hand, some joined the Zionist movement. The Mizrahi movement, as we call it, is one response. You're trying to have it both ways. Let the non-religious do the political work. You understand? That was Rabbi Reines, and they founded the Mizrahi movement. At first things were fine, but then cultural Zionism of Ahad Ha'am took over and came to be seen as a threat, and the Mizrahi did not know how to deal with it. That's the great story of the problematic of religious Zionism. They just didn't know how to deal with that. And that's why Chaim Weizmann was the Avigdor Lieberman of the fin de siècle, because he was the great leader of the left wing that said, let's get rid of the Orthodox. That's who Chaim Weizmann was in his first incarnation. Right? That's who he was in the first decade. The result, or one of the results, was the emergence of Aguda to be like a parallel Zionist movement. You don't represent the Jewish people. We do. The Orthodox do. Okay? Some rabbis opposed the Aguda as being a dangerous left-wing movement. The Hungarians, the Belzer Rebbe, the Munkacher Rebbe. They said, what is this? No. Jews have never had political parties. And if it's new, it's treif. Okay? On the other hand, there were others that said, no, it's pretty Orthodox. Okay? But these very questions that I just raised to you couldn't have been in existence before the years before the First World War. And so the Orthodox, and I leave you with this, were in the incipient stages of becoming politically self-aware. And then the First World War breaks out. That's all for tonight. Jay? That's the end. Thank you.
When I went to a Yad Ha'achim presentation where this woman very cogently explained